the other issue was socioeconomic transformation, because during the Civil War and also in the 80s and in the 90s, you had an arrangement where Syria and Hezbollah took care of Lebanon's security, and the Hariris and the Saudis and the Americans took care of the economy. So you had a disproportionate economic distribution. And what is fascinating, if you go into Hezbollah's think tanks today, the focus of Hezbollah's think tanks is economic reform. It's not its military. And that we found consistently in terms of its focus throughout, is that the focus has shifted from there to here, of dealing with root cause issues, of moving back. So you find that in terms of dealing with these critical issues became an essential component of being able to move forward on the national dialogue security strategy. Because unless you deal with something, for instance, like deconfessionalization, you know, from both Hezbollah's camp and the other camp, the pro-American Saudi camp proposed the Swiss militia model. The General Aoun pro-Hezbollah camp proposed the American model of Republican Guard in a very different form. But if you look at the two models, very similar in principle, very different technically. But both talk about an integration and the maintenance of certain capacity in the resistance. But to deal with that, you cannot have a purely Shia army. That will distort the entire security process in Lebanon. So to be able to get to that point, you have to deal with deconfessionalization in its larger issue. While we were advising the presidency in the first 18 months, it became clear how you're supporting this process. You know, how do you ensure that what happens here benefits the here, and what happens here is going to have an impact over here. And what we looked at, when you looked at the parliament and its functioning, the government and its functioning, and the national dialogue, was that you have three entities that are not always in synchronization, that doesn't draw on the resources of each other. That if it draws on resources, a parliamentary committee or a government ministry, depending, if you have a Christian Maronite there, they will bring in their people to advise. If you have a Hezbollah person there, they will bring in their people to advise. So what we've tried to create was a mechanism which basically sits behind and underneath these top processes. I'll show you in the next slide. We were basically looking at, if you look at your official processes of the dialogue, national dialogue, parliamentary committees, and so forth, how do we support these processes, drawing on society, drawing on experts, drawing on both government and parliament, and on international expertise. And what we looked at is multiple common spaces of looking at interreligious dialogue, external relationships, decentralization, and so forth. Every thematic area where you bring the key experts together that help manage and co-own the stakeholder dialogues on each one of these things. Creating an interconnected process, but also sustaining it. So that there is not what you've seen in Lebanon. We've studied their dialogue now since 1926. They have an extraordinarily rich dialogue. Interreligious dialogue, economic dialogue, political track 1 dialogue, political track 1.5 dialogue, civil society dialogues in Cyprus and Spain and France, in Switzerland, and every other place that would like to have them there, Qatar. They're dialoguing everywhere, and it's an extraordinarily rich history. And it shows you a lot of elements, but one thing that was missing in all of it is a systematic, sustained, ongoing process that does facilitate change in an ongoing basis. And what we've tried to come up with is a change model of sustained dialogue and a structured dialogue based on shared knowledge on the one hand, because you have an extraordinary wealth of knowledge, educated people in your different societies, but pockets of knowledge that are not engaging with each other. So on the one hand, the effort was how do we create an integrated knowledge process of shared knowledge, shared research, and the access of the minimum basic of information that we should share to be able to move forward. For instance, when we looked at the national dialogue process, and you look at all the parties putting their proposals on the table, and it became so obvious that if you look at the different terminology that each of the parties are using, the same terminology that they're using have completely different definitions. If what the one means by militia, and the other one means by resistance, and this one means by national defense strategy, is completely different. And so we actually created a dictionary of Lebanon Common Language, of trying to I'll show you now, we created with, what do you call it, these dictionaries that we get with one definition and many definitions.
Thesaurus.
There you go. So we created one for Lebanon, Thesaurus. And it is a growing one. It's a really fun experience, I must tell you. We really enjoy this experience of getting to a process of having each one articulating. And the beginning of this process, there is no judgment on the definitions. Every definition is in there, and that at least each other understand where they are going. But you know, it was such a difficult situation when every time they make an agreement after each of these dialogues, you're trying to figure out what each one had actually meant by the very dialogue that they've just been in. Because the terminology is, the association of these terminologies are very different. So one component that we worked in the common space, apart from the shared knowledge, research, mapping, the preparatory research for the dialogues, and then the follow-up research and more in-depth research, the generating of options, which everybody had equal access to, was looking also at language and the interpretation of definitions of language in these processes to make sure that component is sufficient.
What is the language? Is it English or
No,
what language are you using? French? Or?
Arabic. Yeah. But we did the dictionary in Arabic, English, and French. So we because some use French terminology,
right?
Because your Christians are primarily French educated, but your Shia are primarily English oriented. A lot of American oriented. Some of the key people in Hezbollah from the Shia families, all American educated or British educated. Many also Farsi educated. So you have a very different combination, and you have also a huge amount of universities. I think for a population of 4 million, they have almost 50 universities. So there is it's not as well versed as Massachusetts and Boston, but you know, they get close there in terms of the number of universities that you have there. What we've then, let me just get you this graphic, I think would be useful. So we looked at the dialogue of the support mechanism in two phases. The one is shared knowledge, and the other one is dialogue and consensus building. Particularly looking for cultural elements and historic elements in that society of consensus building. How do we strengthen that element of consensus building? And how do we have a sustained process of dialogue away from this national process, that there is an ongoing process of the key people that advise the top people, but that they can generate sufficient options and work together and get their researchers to work together on that, with the impact that everything that comes out of this process is for the benefit of the National Dialogue Government Parliament, and creating the elements for more informed and collective and consensual decision-making processes. So over the period of the last 9 months, we created in Lebanon what is now called the Common Space Initiative, which is run all by Lebanese. I'm the only non-Lebanese, and I was chosen because I'm not American and not European and not Middle East. And with that handicap, I also don't speak Arabic, which is, you know, it's a very big handicap. But it was, you know, I think they were looking for people inside the process that could look with new eyes to it, and don't have strategic interest in that political situation. So the common space, as we see it today, I'll show you a little bit an example of what some of this looks like. On the shared knowledge, we created shared knowledge spaces where all the parties are participating in. So they share the knowledge in here, and all of them, they're advisors, and all of them are in the same spaces, whether it is the Future Party or the Druze Party or Hezbollah, they're all in the same process.